Thank you for inviting me. In the third Georgic book, Virgil wrote Tempus Fugit. I think it's a good thing to remember just for the speaker who is speaking before lunch. So I would do my best so that we respect the time frame and finish on time and have not only food for soul but also food for our body. So what is classical culture and education? We have a variety of definitions which either reduce it to ancient Greek or Roman times with their achievements, or without seeing the heritage that it carries over, they concentrate only on its reception and only in some aspects. So I suggest that we adopt another approach. What is behind culture is, first of all, big people who had an impact, a great impact on the culture, that without their thought, without what they suggested, there wouldn't be those strong foundations. So here I would like to present you 3 scenes that would allow us to better see the importance of meeting those big personalities of culture of the Western world, how important it is in our lives and especially in the life of pupils. The last scene will make us ask ourselves whether we are still participants of the same type of culture. The first vision, is a garden that we could see in a very dramatic moment of its destruction, and the second one will lead us to a dark, dangerous forest, which paradoxically will save us. So the first scene is a garden. The year 410 after Christ was a very strange year, which changed the face of Rome. On the 24th of August, under the hot sky of Rome, Marcella and Principia want to find shelter in St. Paul's Basilic, because they are running away from Visigoths, from hordes of Visigoths. As St. Hieronymus said, Marcella wants mercy for Principia. She dies, but Principia is saved, and she became a martyr. There is chaos, horror, death, lack of order. This what it looked like on the 24th of August in Rome. Sacco di Roma. The shock of Imperium Romanum was really huge. Before their very eyes, what was appearing was Civitas Terrena, and at the same time, the martyr of Saint Marcella, a Roman citizen, has shown the universality of Civitatis Dei. It was a day where this orderly and beautiful garden, which had been built for centuries, became a chaotic forest without any paths and roads. What was this garden which could not be restored? It was a huge structure representing Roman ideals, which had to achieve the same goals as the ancient Greeks have achieved, but also completed by a Christian epiphany. What we could see in this garden was a lot of philosophers who would explain through reason what was the world, what was the human being, and this allowed for the other one to steer the world. We could see writers and orators who, in a less rigoristic categories than docebant, movebant, delectabant, would teach and also have some pleasure by understanding very well the role of reason and senses. there were discussions by big rulers. They were vis anime was very important for them, and they took account of Aeneas's words, which were addressed to Roman citizens. You, the ruler, you have to rule peacefully. You have to spare your subjects and refer to war if needed. So who was sitting by the fountain? Those were rulers and legislators who were looking for the best solutions in order to implement sum qui triburere, this rule of justice, to give back to everyone what he deserves. It was not hard to see the biggest ones from the legends and myths, even though they didn't want to adapt to historiographical frameworks. They are known as exempla, illustrating verba docens exempla trafunt, which means that example teach us something new. It was not only a royal garden for the king and his skins. It was for available to everybody. And Respublica Literarum, this was also written at the entrance. Litere, this was the key, indispensable key, in order to start those fruitful debates with those wise people. And this is this litere who was taught at school within the trivium, and this was supposed to introduce people into intellectual and moral values. Homer's and Hesiod's and Aeschylus and Sophocles' and Solon's and Demosthenes, Plato's, Aristotle's and Cincinnatus, Cicero's, Virgil's, Horace, and so on, Boëthius' gardens in 410. So what was the question to be asked? Is it going to die forever or being demolished forever? Scene number 2.
A dark forest. Here goes Dante Divine Comedy, beginning. So the image of the beginning of Divine Comedy by Dante is a completely different image. It's very expressive. It draws our attention to the contrast that we're about to see. Midway up on the journey of my life, I found myself within a forest dark. So the dark forest is strong, it's dangerous, rough, savage, and stern. So it's like a hopeless situation. However, Dante is not just a traveler who lost his way, not just his life is midway. He says, our life, nostra vita, which explains to us that we can see a vision for the entire humanity, but at the same time for each individual who is in a similar situation. Anna Maria Clavacci-Leonardi, in her commentary to these verses, she said that Dante embodied the entire humanity. The objective of writing this was to make people less poor, take people out of poverty and towards happiness. Each one of us can identify with Dante's image. We even have to, we should find ourselves in the situation if we're supposed to reach the same goal. being lost, morally lost, not knowing what is the purpose of your life, being overwhelmed with your problems, emotions, your personal dramas. They are represented by being lost in the middle of a dark forest. But then he says, bene, good, in the 8th verse. But of the good to treat, which there I found. So there is bitter, there is danger, but also good. And this is something that allows the traveler to talk about his journey. He notices the good, even though he deems himself unworthy when he sees 3 savage animals that are the representation of spiritual slavery, that don't allow you to use reason in a proper way, and he shouts, miserere. At this point, having experienced the void of his life, he understands the need of being guided by a master. Tu duca, tu signore, e tuo maestro. You are my master, you are my leader, you are my master. And he meets Virgil. Virgil, his master from Mantua. It's like a middle good, which will soon prove not enough. However, it's necessary on his path towards the greater good, the final good. So the master who guides the pilgrim represents the totality of the garden that has been destroyed by the barbarians but has survived in the works of those sapiente eruditi docti of the authors. Dante himself bases his pursuit of truth on the foundations on which his culture was built. Even though he aims for a world where not Apollo on Pacto resounds in the choirs, he, however, appreciates the legacy of the antique world which he is a part of, so much that he allows himself to be guided by Virgil, his greatest authority. Dante, the pilgrim, goes towards the garden, the paradise, the Christian paradise. His guide, Roman prophet, makes him understand that his teachings are not enough, and at a certain point he withdraws to create space for a person who can transcend the terrestrial towards greater enlightenment. Scene 3. Polish school. In antiquity they said repetitio est mater studiorum, and bis repetita placent. So if we are praising the achievements of the antiquity, let's use it in practice in reference to what we heard in the previous congresses of classical education, the tips and tricks we've been given. So I think you will agree with me that Polish school needs classical education. About a year ago, Piotr Szychowski, during the second edition of the Congress of Classical Education, he said that it should be based on the liberal arts. So in order to function properly, they have to be exactly what they mean, some skills to solve problems that are aligned with our life goals. We have to shape our intellect, our will. He stressed that this process requires a journey similar to Odyssea. There were great heroes like the Modoc at a feast with the Atyaks. He fought, he suffered, he forged his own heroicness. By gaining knowledge, we leave behind our old schemes and we search for something unknown. ourselves and pupils of Polish schools should have it much easier because they do have guides that they can trust. Liberal arts, even though they have been codified in the medieval ages, they have much deeper roots in Greek and Roman antiquity. They were created by nameless erudites and great sages whose names we already know and whom we have seen in the medieval garden. So the conclusion is clear. They should be our guides in the Polish school curriculum. If we agree that every person, not just pupils, but teenagers, adolescents, come through a dark forest of being lost on a different planes and layers, Polish school should present a remedy by deeply, empathically meeting masters such as Virgil. Dante, who travels guided by a poet, the greatest poet, says that he knew the totality of Aeneida by heart. This leads us to the question, do we have at Polish schools, can we plant such a deep love in young people, to not just acquaint themselves, but to make friends with the greatest poets and erudites? Many could say, well, there are many materials, and we have to read a lot. There are so many topics at schools, so many subjects. But what is actually the goal of teaching literature according to Trivium? Is it just about ticking them off the list, or is it about knowing them deeply and receiving them and perceiving them inside of us deeply? So sometimes during history or Polish language classes at school, there is not much space to go deeper into the texts. Pupils don't need to read Cicero or Sebastian's speeches to learn about the reasons of the downfall of the Roman Empire. We do not have to follow, together with Ovid, through the metamorphosis of humans and gods. It's not just about a simple choice of what should we dedicate time to in schools and what we can just omit or skip through. What should be the canon for young people to refer to in further years of education, in their intellectual pursuits after they graduate from schools and colleges and become fully responsible for their intellectual and moral development? Repetitio est mater studiorum. 2 years ago, during the first Congress of Classical Education, Dr. Piotr Kwasniewski spoke clearly and convinced the audience that teaching on the basis of big books, great books, is the only way to teach classical education, because this is a meeting, an encounter with the great masters. Dante couldn't know the movement of the great books because it was created several centuries after he died, but it was about searching for the sources of wisdom. He knew that great books were the way to his goal, because that was the foundation of Artes Liberales. The breviarium of the Canon of Culture mentioned by Dr. Milcarek, the movement of great books, and so on, they demonstrate an idea that can be summed up in one sentence. Doesn't matter what. What matters is to read. As a teacher, I often meet parents who are proud that their children read a lot, and I ask them about the titles of the books, and I then want to cite quintillion tips on education. And he said, I must stress that for a long time you should read only the best authors, those who fail us the least and fail our trust the least. But young people, and not just young people, people as such, who read many books, they never actually read one important book that would allow them to go back to the garden, to go on the journey towards the garden. Just as Mr. Górecki said, Polish books have a new opportunity for acquainting themselves with antique culture. And what I'm referring to is that we can finally learn Latin in schools, selecting it as our second foreign language. But even the most perfect curriculum does not guarantee success. However, the proposed solutions allow us to have hope. We could ask, how Latin language with so much declination, conjugation, difficult grammar, endless prepositions, clauses, subordinate clauses, how are they supposed to lead to a meeting encounter with great authors? From our experience, however, we know that by loving the language, we sometimes arrive at loving the language through literature. Because if you love literature so much, you love French literature, you've only read translations, and you decide to learn French, which is a difficult language to learn. The same happened with me. Yours truly, when I read Cicero and Seneca at school for the first time, I knew that I had to read the original because that would contain so much more content. So why not Latin? In schools, and not just in schools, from the very beginning, we can show the greatest authors to pupils, the greatest books. Maybe some of them will start loving the language itself in which those texts were created. Can we teach antique culture without teaching Latin language? Yes, we can. Many people, for different reasons, had never had an opportunity to learn Latin, the language of Cicero, St. Thomas, and others, even though we transmit antique culture. Another question. So why should we dedicate time to Latin language and effort to learn it? The first speaker said that we are all Romans. Latin is not a foreign language for us, and we should become aware of that. Latin is our language. It belongs to us. Even in Poland, we used to speak Latin. I'm a Polish aristocrat, I speak Latin. That was what people would say. One Latin sentence that I just said, it shows how little Latin we understand in Poland today, because if I started speaking Latin, how many of you would understand me? Polish literature and Latin literatures are one and the same thing. 2 years ago, during the first edition of the Congress of Classical Education, Katarzyna Ochman clearly said and encouraged us to learn Latin. Why? In order to read Polish texts of Polish authors who wrote in Latin. And I also experienced this. In the 17th century, there was a Krasper Druszczewski. It was he was a priest, and he only wrote in Latin. Today, we don't have many scientists who would be able to read those works, to explain them to a reader. If you didn't learn Latin language, A second argument, Latin teaches us logical thinking. Can we only learn logical thinking through Latin? No, of course not. We can learn logical thinking through other languages as well.
Yes, but let's look at the basis of learning Latin language. If now in the handbook of Polish language we can find some parts, rhetoric parts, by Greta Thunberg, which is now supposed to be replacing Cicero and Demosthenes and be the role model of rhetorics. If we have to learn English through texts about veganism or other well-known theories, if we have to learn the French language based on texts which would praise the French Revolution and its magnitude, this is the difference, because the Latin language would give us texts of authors who would really, truly shape the intellect and the will of a young person at school. The third argument, which is some kind of wrap-up of my presentations, the access to authors. It's them who would become friends of a young man at Finem. We can see the opinion that the worst thing that can happen to education is getting back to medieval ages. I would wish the Polish education to come back to the Middle Ages. I would wish the education to come back to ancient times, the source of our civilization, which, if well lived and understood by young people, would be a template based on which such young people would shape their lives. Thank you very much.